Hey folks, welcome back. Today is a leatherworking day because I need to make a fancy sheath for this fancy hunting knife that I made in the last video. So the plan for the sheath is I'm going to make it out of vegetable tanned cowhide with a thin leather liner and a caiman skin inlay on the front. If you don't know what a caiman is a type of reptile, kind of like a small crocodile. You know, I saw one once, but not for very long because he just came and left. And on that note, let's get cutting some leather.
I always like to start with a template when I make a sheath, and I designed this one on thin cardboard and cut it out so that I can trace it directly onto the leather. The little drawing tool that I'm using is called a scratch awl, and it doesn't actually scratch. It has a small rounded point, so it leaves a little indent in the leather, but doesn't damage it. And then I can follow it with my paring knife. Once I've finished cutting out the outline for this front sheath panel, then I cut out the windows where the inlay will be. I need to be extra careful to follow the line while I'm cutting out these windows because the punch-outs from the center will become the backing for the inlay. So I need them to be exactly their final shape just after cutting with a knife. The leather I'm using here is 6 to 7 ounce vegetable tanned cowhide from Wickett & Craig. Because I'm intending to add a liner to this sheath, I don't want to use thicker leather, otherwise I'll end up with a sheath that is bulky and cumbersome. After I've finished cutting the front panel, then it's time to move on to the other components, including the back panel and the belt loops. On this type of sheath, there's a spacer that goes around the edges to create a cavity inside where the knife slides in. And I use a strap cutter, otherwise known as a plow gauge, to cut even strips for these spacers. I need the back spacer to be thicker at the end to accommodate the extra thickness of the knife handle. And so I cut a couple of extra pieces of leather to layer on the spacer and add that extra thickness. Then I will skive down their ends so they create a nice smooth taper. The skiving process starts by sharpening the skiving knife. Having a sharp knife for this purpose is extremely important. Skiving is best done on a hard, flat surface so that the leather doesn't bend as you apply pressure to it with the knife. Traditionally, a granite surface plate or a lithography stone is used, and I use the stainless steel plate on my bench. Once both those edges are tapered, then I glue them to the back spacer. Here you can see the tapered back spacer. Now I'm going to set this piece aside while I work on some other components. The next step is to dye the front and back panels. This is the back panel, which is getting a textured sort of dye job with black leather dye on a dauber. The front panel that'll have the caiman skin inlay is going to be dyed fully black for contrast. I use a generous amount of dye for the front panel, and I dye all the inside edges of those windows because they'll be visible on the final piece. As the dye dries, I go back to the bench with the skiving knife, this time to prepare the belt loop. Skiving all these components helps to reduce any unnecessary bulk in the sheath to make it sleeker and more comfortable to carry. It takes patience and practice to learn how to skive, and it definitely increases the amount of time required to build a sheath, but I think the end result is worth it. Once I've glued together the loop portion of the belt loop, then it's time to work on the inlays. And that means I need to break out the caiman skin and figure out which part I want to use.
So I think I'm going to use this part of the caiman tail for this, so that I get this area and that area more or less.
Now it's time to create the backings for the inlay. As I mentioned previously, the backings are made from the punch-outs of the front panel. And I skive each of the edges to make a domed shape that will push up the middle of the inlay. And after shaping it with a skiving knife, then I sand the surface to make sure that it's smooth and even. And now it's time to glue the backing to the inlay itself. I'm using a PVA bookbinder's glue for all of the assembly in this sheath. I use a polished steel burnisher, which won't scratch the leather, to push the inlay down around the backing. Before I stitch these inlays in place, it's important to burnish and polish the inside edges of those windows where the inlay will be. Burnished edges make for a much nicer, cleaner looking sheath.
Pretty much all of my work in bladesmithing involves learning as I go. This first caiman skin inlay that I tried, I was thinning out the edge with my skiving knife after kind of gluing it in place, and I accidentally nicked the corner of the face, so it would show, this little nick basically would show up in the finished inlay, and I don't want that.
So anyway, I made a new backing and I cut a new inlay and glued them together, and now I'm ready to glue that whole second portion into the sheath. Here's how it looks before stitching. I also decided to smooth out the back of the inlay so that it'll sit nicely on the liner. Then I'm ready to sew the inlay panels in place. The sewing process starts by marking and punching the holes with a double-pronged pricking iron. Believe it or not, this is the first project I've used a pricking iron for, and I'm really pleased with the way it works. I've gotten pretty good at punching holes by hand with an awl, but the level of consistency afforded by the pricking iron is hard to match.
The stitch I'm doing is called a saddle stitch, and the saddle stitch uses two different needles that do two stitches simultaneously that go back and forth. The most important thing about a saddle stitch is that every single stitch you do, you need to do the same order of operations. So the way I do it is I put my front needle through, which opens up the hole so that I can then put the needle through from the back. I'll pull that one through part of the way, and then this front needle goes back in, and as I push the front needle in, I pull back a little bit on the thread, and that helps to keep that needle from piercing through the thread, which would cause issues. And then I simply pull it tight. And I just need to do this over and over again until it's all stitched together.
The client and I agreed that this sheath should have a strap to hold the knife in place, so that means I need to add a button stud, also known as a Sam Browne stud, to give that strap something to fasten to.
I'm pretty close to being able to stitch this whole sheath together, but I just realized that this back piece needs a strap, so I'm going to have to cut out a new one. That was something that I should have thought of early on, and I guess I neglected to do that.
And then of course I need to dye this back panel to match the previous one. And now that the front and back panels and the belt loop are all complete, it's time to add the linings. I'm using a 2 to 3 ounce vegetable tanned cowhide for the linings here. Adding a liner to the sheath helps to protect the blade even further and also makes for a nice snug fit. I glue the lining leather directly to the front and back panels of the sheath, and then I'll sew around the edge to make sure that the pieces of leather don't come apart. It's pretty straightforward except for the fact that on the back panel I also need to sew in the belt loop. The belt loop is sewed directly to the back panel, and I want the stitches to lie underneath the lining. So I have to glue the back lining in two parts. I glue the top edges first where I'll be stitching. I'll stitch that together, and then I'll stitch the belt loop in, and then I'll glue the rest of the lining. Both leatherworking and knife making involve a huge number of processes. Then you have to go through each one in sequence, and knowing the order in which to do all of these processes is something that just comes with experience and a lot of common sense, and oftentimes the common sense doesn't seem so common until you've had the experience of screwing it up and having to do it over. The more separate components you have in a project, the more complex the order of operations is, and the more critical it is to get it right. This particular sheath has 13 different pieces of leather, and that's not counting thread and fasteners. And that makes it one of the most complex leather projects I've done to date. Once I've glued on both the front and back liners, then it's time to stitch around the top edges of each of them. I'm using a saddle stitch for the top edges of the liners, just as I did for the inlays. But in this case, instead of using the pricking iron to punch the holes, I used a small round punch, and I made the holes closer together. The tighter, straighter stitch allows me to sew closer to the edge of the leather, and I believe this stitch is also more advantageous for the strap, which will bend back and forth. And now that I've sewed the back lining in place, it's time to fasten the belt loop onto the back panel of the sheath. And then I can finally glue the rest of the lining in place.
So now it's time to glue in the spacers. As if I hadn't done enough sewing already, it's finally time to sew this whole thing together. You know, this is the most important stitch, really, the thing that keeps the front and the back all together, and it goes through this really thick welt back here. So I've got to get a thread through almost ½ an inch of leather at the back. But in order to make sure that my stitches are aligned both front and back, I'm going to take it to the grinder and I'm going to roughly smooth out the edges so that then I can draw a line on both the front and back and make sure that my threads are lined up. So I got all the holes punched. Now I got to measure out the thread. So I've got here my linen thread. And for these thick welts, I always take 3 times the length of the welt for each side of the saddle stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, and then I'll double that. And add a little extra. Thread is cheap, redoing it takes time. Time is expensive. This particular thread isn't waxed, so I need to wax it with a little beeswax. I just pull it through the beeswax cake and then rub it in with my fingers, and the friction melts the wax into the thread. All right, then I gotta thread the needle. Like so. And then we pierce the thread with the needle. Like that. And lock it on here. Now that needle won't come off. All right, there's 1/2 of the stitching. It's all done. See how it looks on the back? Pretty nice and straight.
And now we're really in the home stretch, just a few dozen more stitches. Here you can also take a look at my homemade stitching pony. It's basically a wooden clamp with leather-covered jaws so it doesn't scratch the leather. And the jaws are a little bit springy so that they can conform to the different tapers in the sheath. And with that, the stitching is complete.
Alrighty, here's the moment of truth. I'm going to put this knife in the sheath. Fits pretty well. And then this little strap needs to come over here. All right, well, the sheath is now functional and 90% complete. The very last step I need to do is burnish all of the edges and make them shiny. I'm also going to dye them black. So that is the last step that I need to do.
There are many different ways to get a nice burnished finish on a leather welt, but it usually involves some combination of sanding and rubbing with a slicking compound. I do the initial sanding on the belt sander, which gives me a nice smooth edge. And then I use either gum tragacanth or beeswax and rub it into the edge with a dowel spinning in my lathe. For this particular sheath, I use gum tragacanth followed by beeswax, though I don't know that the combination of the two is any better than either one of them alone. And then the only trick is to just keep sanding and rubbing until you're satisfied with the results. And once the edges are shiny and uniform, the very last step is to add a coat of conditioner to keep the leather in good shape. The conditioner fills the pores in the leather, moisturizing it and making it shiny and more water resistant. It's also a great opportunity for me to look over the sheath and scrutinize all of the little details and flaws and things that I did wrong, or just admire the work. Depending on my mood, it could be either.
Just like that, the sheath is done. Good and solid. Not going to come out. Pretty easy to open up and deploy.